Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm Hilary Salt.
And we are filming again today. We're going to keep doing this despite the fact that we are novices when it comes to
absolutely, and we still have no hair and makeup for me.
Right, I know. Maybe they're late coming, but the office is just a mess of cables and cameras. And
Don't tell them
stuff.
that.
No?
Don't tell them that.
Behind this, it just looks beautiful. I can see Old Trafford though.
Yeah, and the blue sky. Blue sky in Manchester today.
Right, it's a delight. So today we're going to be covering a couple of news items. For anybody that wasn't listening last week, we're doing the news now in a separate episode. So today's episode will just be two news items that Hilary and I have picked out to discuss. We will then have a separate episode where we're joined by a guest to talk about some solutions to a particular political problem. And this week we'll be joined by
Stephen Balloch, who's the chair of the SDP. And remember that Culture Club is also in the separate episode as well.
Yeah, I don't big Culture Club up enough, do I?
Well, I hesitate to say you're not very cultured, Sebastian.
I'm trying to be.
You're trying. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the news today, you're going to be talking about?
The energy price cap, which I don't know if you had the radio on this morning, but it was all over the news this morning. And you're probably not as geeky as me in that you don't probably look at all the things like Martin Lewis and the financial pages of the newspapers. But there's a huge debate about things like whether you should cap your, whether you should change your energy tariff and so on. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the cap as it is.
I'm amazed you think I have a radio.
Okay. I knew you didn't have a television. I thought you might have a wireless, as we used to call them.
No, I haven't listened to the radio in a few years.
I remember going to my dad's at one point, and my dad was talking about the wireless. And for my sons, wireless means something quite different.
Right.
For my dad, it's a radio. For them, it's the Wi-Fi.
But it wasn't a wireless radio.
No, it was a plugged-in radio.
Seems like a bit of an oxymoron to me.
I think it's because they had... oh gosh, what are the things that they put in amateur radio called? When you build your own radio, you have a lot of things in there that are not wires. And I can't remember what they are, sorry.
Okay.
Somebody will write in and tell us, I'm sure.
And I'm going to be talking about Ukraine, because that seems to be the big story at the moment. And should we kick off with Ukraine? I don't know. Which one do you want to kick off with?
I don't mind which way we go. We're establishing this little... division of labour, aren't we? Where you do the big global things and I do the dead geeky stuff.
Yeah, I think it works to an extent. Yeah. So Ukraine is it's always in the news, obviously.
Yes.
And that will pick up at certain times. And at the moment, it is particularly prominent in the news for a couple of reasons. Particularly one, Donald Trump.
Indeed.
Because Donald Trump, if there's anything you can say about him, he likes being in the news.
He does, yeah.
And he manages to get himself in the news probably on a daily basis, which is pretty good going. And
probably we should just say, maybe before we start dipping into the kind of big global politics aspects of this, that, clearly it is a human tragedy as well. And it's hard not to get too involved in a kind of soap opera attitude towards it, but we should remember that it people are dying on a daily basis.
Yes, no, you're quite right. I think it's easy for us, certainly here in a warm office, in a safe country, to speak about it in quite a glib way.
Yeah.
It's a tragedy. Yeah. And I think everybody can agree on that, no matter what side you take in terms of the Ukraine-Russia war. So it's almost difficult to know where to start with Ukraine, because there's constantly stuff happening. And something we were just talking about before the podcast is that everybody's got an opinion. Everybody comes out with stuff. And before you've even had time to kind of check whether there's any truth to those facts, it's moved on and the agenda's moved on, because we live in this constant news cycle.
Yes.
And it's hard to even remember what happened last week.
Yeah.
So the news at the moment is that Ukraine and the US have signed this rare earth minerals deal. Mm. And the reports suggest that what that means is that any future exploration of these minerals, the US will get 50% of the proceeds.
extraction. I think you maybe exploration. You said extraction.
Extraction.
I think selling it is important, isn't it?
Yes.
Making money from it.
Yeah. So the US will get half of any of the revenue. Now, something we were talking about beforehand is, what does that mean? Does it mean 50% of the profits?
Yeah.
And we think it probably means 50% of the profits.
Yes.
Now, it's not obvious what Ukraine gets in return for this. Trump has said that the US has been giving all of this money to Ukraine and all of this military aid and has nothing in return. So this is his chance to sort of sell to the US this idea that the US is actually getting something in return. And he said that what this offers Ukraine is a chance to fight on. So he's basically said, if you want to fight on, you've got to give us something back.
Yeah.
Now, Ukraine have said that this was actually their deal, so their idea, this deal.
Oh, right, okay.
So somebody's just come out literally in the last couple of hours, one of their officials, and said this was our idea of giving
I missed that.
the US some money. So it's along with that, we've had all of the stuff with Trump and Putin in terms of bringing the Russians to the negotiation table.
Yeah.
Now, this has caused a huge storm because Trump has said a few things about Zelensky and about Ukraine that suggests that some of the reports about him being very pro-Putin in the lead up to the election in the last few years do have some accuracy to them because he's being incredibly deferential to Russia.
He's called Zelensky a dictator, hasn't he?
Exactly.
Because he's not had elections.
Yeah, so the thing with the elections is that Zelensky's term as president ended in May 2024.
Yeah.
But under martial law, according to Ukrainian law, they can't have fresh presidential elections. And martial law is being extended every 3 months. So the parliament extends it every 3 months. And some people in America have said, we had elections during the Second World War. But I think that's very, very different because America wasn't being bombed. Mainland America wasn't under attack constantly. Yeah. And if you look at the UK, which was much closer to a lot of the fighting and was being bombed during the Second World War, they did hold off the elections and they had a national coalition. So
that's right, yes.
I think it's easy. I think a lot of the democracy angle, us in the West, we're saying we're fighting for Ukraine as the sort of the liberal democracy. I think that's there is a challenge to that in some ways because I think Ukraine isn't as strong of a democracy as the UK is, but also some of the attacks from the other side, from sort of, let's say, the Trump wing, are a little bit unfounded, I think.
I agree. I think it will be very tricky to run an election campaign when you're fighting a war.
Exactly. So I wanted to just share a few details about the war and about the money that's gone to Ukraine. Because it's easy, like we were saying, for all of this to happen and we kind of get lost in, we forget the kind of big picture of what's happened so far.
Yeah.
So, for example, the military aid. So since Russia invaded in February 2022, the CNN have said that the total aid that's gone to Ukraine is $380 billion.
Okay.
Now, it's complicated and it's very difficult to find exact figures. Part of the reason for that is that the aid isn't necessarily in cash. Right?
Yeah.
It comes in many different ways. A lot of it will be defense equipment.
Yeah.
Now, how do you value the defense equipment that you're sending? Tricky. And every country has a different way of measuring that. So the Americans' way of measuring it is very different to the British way of measuring the value of the military aid that we're giving.
Yeah.
And some of, a lot of people will say that a lot of the equipment we're sending is actually quite old stuff that we wanted to replace anyway.
Okay, yeah.
So there's, again, a complete rabbit hole to go down with regards to that. So within that $380 billion, there's $120 billion of that is military aid.
Okay.
So to put it into perspective, do you know what the UK defence budget is?
So it's at least 2% of GDP, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
you're going to have to do the maths.
I know, I can't do maths.
It's 57 billion pounds.
Okay.
So 57 billion pounds, which would be about $70 billion, something like that. And the military aid that's been given to Ukraine is $120 billion.
Okay.
So that puts it into perspective.
It does.
This massive amount of money.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, they're fighting a ground war against Russia, so they need a lot of money. Again, another thing that's complicated is how many people have died. So this seems like a crucial thing to know how many casualties have there been, and the figures on this vary massively. So Russia will say a certain thing. Russia, until December 2024, were claiming that they'd only lost a few thousand men. And then suddenly they upped that, and they came out and said that there have been nearly 1 million casualties in Ukraine. So you get wildly different figures from whoever you ask, but I think we can all agree that there have been hundreds of thousands dead on each side.
Yes.
For sure.
Okay.
So like you said, it's a huge tragedy. What Trump is now doing in attempting to end the war, I think, is admirable. Some of the ways he's going about that are very questionable.
Less so, yeah.
And I said this on the podcast last week, that I become more and more sympathetic to Trump's cause until I hear him speak. And then he comes out with some of these things and you think, what? What on earth is he talking about? And I think suggesting that Putin is a fair, democratically elected leader and Zelensky isn't is just crazy in my eyes.
Bonkers, indeed, yeah. Now, somebody you've not mentioned so far is Elon Musk. So what's really important to the Ukrainians is... I was going to say Starburst, but that's not right, is it? That's the sweets. Starlink, yeah. Though an army does march on its stomach, though, doesn't it? So maybe Starburst are important as well. Starlink is the thing that they are relying on for all their communications, isn't it? And Elon Musk has kind of dialed up the pressure by saying he might withdraw that. Is that right?
I've not heard about that.
Okay, so I mean, this is one of those areas, isn't it, where exactly when is Musk behaving like part of the government and when is he behaving like a private citizen? That's kind of I find that really confusing.
This is multifaceted, and we've talked many times about how complex political issues become reduced to this false binary where you're either pro-Russia or a pro-Russia sympathizer or you're pro-Ukraine, pro-war. Yeah. And it's complex. And I think Trump coming out and everything that's happened in the last couple of weeks have sort of unearthed a few of those fault lines. Yeah. And until now, the West has sort of seemingly been on the same page with this, where they're just saying we need to constantly give more and more money to Ukraine because they need to defend their sovereignty, etc. And whilst I think Trump is dangerous in many ways because he's so careless with the things he says, I do think it's a good thing that he's attempting to get both sides to the negotiation table, because since February 2022, many of us have been aware that the only way this is going to end is for both sides to come to the negotiation table, because you have Russia that is fully committed to this. There is no escape plan for them. And you have Ukraine that is supported by the West with billions of dollars of military aid. So this is just going to continue being a bloodbath where more and more men are going to die. And the only way for this to end is for there to be some negotiation. Now, the difficulty with that is you have to give Russia enough so that they say, yeah, fair enough, it was worth it to go into Ukraine. And Putin can turn to his population and say, yeah, that we did the right thing in invading. But also not enough to suggest that it was right for him to invade. And this is the really difficult thing, because what is so important with this is that whatever the negotiation settlement is, we don't say to the world, it's fine just to go and invade a sovereign neighbour. And that is the challenge for the leaders.
And you're saying you kind of welcome Trump's involvement in this. I guess the one-sidedness of it just feels that he's putting a lot of pressure on Ukraine. It doesn't feel like he's putting very much pressure on Russia. Do you think that's happening behind the scenes?
I don't know, but what I would say is that you have to get Russia to come to the table. Yeah. And he's doing that. And I do think there needs to be some sort of deference to Russia in order to accept the fact that we have to kind of get to a peace deal, right? And he said certain things. You know, Pete Hegseth came out and said, it's very unlikely we're going to go back to pre-2014 borders, which is great because everybody knows that. Anybody sensible knows that. Yeah. Ukraine are not taking all of the invaded territories back as well as Crimea. That is not happening, right, in any rational world. So to come out and say that, it gives something to Russia, but it's just acknowledging reality, and I think we need a little bit more of that. Where Trump is interesting then is, and I was having this argument with some friends recently about why Americans or certainly why a lot of Americans support Trump, is because a lot of people care more about what he does than what he says.
Yeah.
And the anti-Trump people always come out with things and say, he said this, he said that. And I think, yeah, but they don't care so much about that. They understand that he comes and says crazy things, but it's what he does that is important to them. Now, there's a slight change from that, and I was listening. Can I shout out another podcast? Can I?
Yes, you may do. Yes,
So
we'll let you do that.
Yes, Spiked did a podcast just this week gone, and Jacob, forgetting his surname, who works in Brussels.
Yes.
I can't remember his surname.
Oh, yeah.
Apologies, Jacob.
Yeah.
He made a really good point, which is that in foreign policy, what you say is important. And what you say is almost what you do, really, because you're making claims that then will affect the actions of other governments.
Yes.
So this is where foreign policy, I think, is different to domestic policy. And whilst in America, Trump can come out and say crazy stuff, but then does things and you judge him on his actions, I think we do have to judge him on what he says when it comes to foreign policy, because that does affect the actions of other countries. I mean, I don't know if you saw, but Keir Starmer was suggesting that we might send troops to Ukraine.
He was, yeah.
To me, is very, very scary.
Absolutely.
I don't think there's any reason why British troops should be going and fighting in Ukraine.
Agreed.
And then Ed Davey, who...
peacekeeping.
Of course, they will use this language, but for me, it's scary. Ed Davey comes out, and even though he's the leader of an opposition party, he comes out and suggests that this should be a vote in Parliament and anybody would back it because we need to have, troops going over there and fighting. And Ed Davey becoming a warmonger was not on my 2025 bingo card.
Indeed, absolutely.
But there you go.
Yeah. So I think you started off talking about the minerals deal. Yeah. We've kind of strayed quite a long way away from there, but your view is it that the mineral deal will be a key part of how this gets resolved, how we reach some kind of peace? Potentially.
I mean, I think here's the good side of what's happened in the last week or 2 weeks is that Putin is coming to the negotiation table, and that is required whether we like it or not. Trump has said some quite outlandish things.
Yeah.
And Zelensky is making a deal with Trump on the rare earth minerals. So the most important, most powerful country in the world is managing to have conversations and negotiations with both Ukraine and Russia. And I think that is a much better place than what we could be in.
Yeah. So kind of watch this space, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's get on to more domestic issues. So the energy price cap. Now, just before you start on this, this is another one of those issues where, to me, I just don't get any of it because as a consumer, I pay my energy bill. I have no idea what I'm paying. I don't know why I'm paying that amount. And then you see news stories like the one this week about the energy price cap being raised in April.
Yeah, and I think many people are just like you, don't really pay it very much attention, but perhaps do notice when there's less in their bank account at the end of the month when they've paid all their standing charges and direct debits than perhaps they were used to. So I think that's how it hits people, really. That's when they do notice it. So the energy price cap is the amount that government have set as the maximum that suppliers can charge on their default tariff rate. Now, I think it causes a lot of confusion because the figure that's generally quoted to say what is the energy price cap is the cost for a typical household. So it's not the cost that anybody pays, except by happenstance if you happen to be the typical one. So the number that's often quoted is this typical number, and the number that it's going up to from April is £1,849. So you could be paying more than that or less than that, depending on how typical you are as a household. So if you're a much bigger household, you're paying more than that. If you're much smaller, you pay less than that. But this cap is the amount that's set that kind of determines how much they can charge per unit of electricity and as a standing charge, so that you get to this number for the typical household. The other number that's been bandied around quite a lot in the news over the past days, it's 6.4% higher than it was up to the end of April. So they set this quarterly. But in reality, in inflation terms, we generally compare prices now with what they were a year ago. And if you do that comparison, the new number is 9% higher than it was a year ago. So you probably noticed that January inflation was higher than expected, 3.9%.
Of course, I noticed that.
Yes, I'm sure you did, yes. Now, households spend about 10% on energy. So if that bit of what they're spending is 9% higher now, or in April, than it was a year ago, that's going to feed through to inflation. And you need everything else to either go down or stay the same for, that not to drive inflation higher. And also just note that the cost of energy affects the cost of everything. So it's not just the cost of your energy bill. If energy prices are higher, then people growing tomatoes pay more to keep the greenhouse from freezing overnight. So the cost of tomatoes goes up. Everything, is affected. It's not just about domestic electricity charges. So I'm guessing the question you're thinking is, why has it gone up? Yeah. So the kind of absolutely straightforward answer to that, the direct reason why it's gone up is because the way that the price cap is set, which is set out in regulations, is based on the cost to suppliers of supplying the energy. So in other words, it's based on the international price of energy, which is largely gas. Generally talking about gas. Gas for the UK is still about 40% of our energy. So gas is not, when we talk about gas being our energy, it's not just gas in terms of gas boilers and, employers, so businesses using gas. It's the fact that a lot of our electricity is generated using gas. So gas makes up about 40% of our energy usage. And international gas prices are rising, partly linked to the point you've been talking about. So the Russia-Ukraine war, and Russian gas is still being supplied to Europe, but some of those pipelines were turned off quite recently. Bit of a debate, I think, about the extent to which the sanctions that the EU has imposed on Russia are really being followed. And I think we covered this in a podcast a while ago, didn't we, about they're routing gas a different way to effectively mean that the EU can still use Russian gas. So that is all. That's the reason why. If you ask, for example, off Gem, why has the energy price cap gone up? It's because international gas prices have gone up. But if we kind of dig a little bit underneath that and say, why is it that international gas prices are affecting the cost that we pay for energy? The reason is because we do still import quite a bit of gas. So, gas prices are important. But also, even to the extent that we have gas that's supplied in the UK, that is, available on an international market. So you can't expect somebody who is providing gas in the UK to sell it in the UK for less than if they sent it to France. So, you can't even you can't even protect the price of UK made gas. So international prices are going up. So what that means is that the kind of way the formula works pushes the price cap up.
So the price cap is just an attempt to limit the profits that energy companies are making.
Correct.
Because it's not saying you cannot charge more than this. It's saying if energy is costing more, we're going to raise that. So we're just going to limit the amount that you can take off the top.
That's right.
And was this brought in under Liz Truss?
It was. And remember, at that point, prices were changing really quickly. They were very, very volatile. And what that meant was that there was a period at that time when, because this is only set quarterly, energy suppliers were then actually having to buy power at a higher price than the cap. And therefore, in other words, the government was subsidising households because, they weren't allowed to charge actually what it had cost them to provide that energy.
Okay.
Now it's more of a profit limiter, although at one point
Okay.
it was a direct subsidy
But the subsidy was going from the government to whom?
to households.
But the households were paying less for energy than it was costing the energy providers.
Correct.
So
exactly.
how were the energy providers doing that?
So, in other words, the government was saying you can only charge the householder this much.
Yeah.
They would give the difference to the energy companies,
see.
but effectively it was households who benefited from it.
And that doesn't happen anymore.
No, it's just really a profit limiter.
But we didn't have a price cap before Liz Truss, or did we?
No, we didn't. No,
Okay.
no. This was all about. I don't know if you can remember back then, but the whole the Ukraine-Russia war and other global instabilities just made the price of fuel really rocket. And I think everybody was worried about, whether they would be able to keep the lights on effectively.
So it was brought in under Liz Truss, the Libertarian.
Yeah.
It's a weird political world we live in, isn't
It's
it?
a very weird political world we live in, yeah. But getting back to energy, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that might have helped and make this not as much of an issue for us? So if you look at France, for example, energy prices in France are not anywhere near as high as they are here. And that's because they have quite a significant nuclear provision of energy, which we haven't done. And I welcome the fact that we are diversifying our energy supply and we're using some wind and solar power. But when you rely on those intermittent power sources, you always have to have gas as well as a backup.
Yeah, and what you mean when you say we haven't done that with nuclear is we did do that, but we've stopped doing it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, I think that we agree on that, don't we? There was a point in January, I think the first couple of weeks in January, when we had a really close, near miss, you might call it, when we had no wind, but it was very, very cold. And the gas suppliers were charging about 100 times the average price to fill in for that fact that, there were no, there was no power coming through that wind provision. And the other thing that I think is, criticism I would make of our current energies strategy is that we're not making the most of the fossil fuels that we do have. So I think we've talked before about this, the North Sea oil that government will not allow us to exploit. There are still coal fields in the UK that we're not using. There had been a proposal to build a new coal mine near Preston, and that has been kiboshed effectively. And there is a massive shale gas siting that could be exploited in Lincolnshire that would serve all our gas needs for the next 5 to 10 years. So not doing all this means that we are massively at the mercy of those international gas prices.
And at the mention of the words fossil fuels, we've just lost a few listeners.
Probably, yeah. But
of course, you're saying we should be using our own fossil fuels rather than importing them from elsewhere, because these green policies of, it's great to say we don't use any fossil fuels here until you then have to go and import them anyway because you have to in order to provide for your energy needs.
Exactly, yeah. And we've not provided the alternatives. Mentioned already that the price of energy doesn't just affect households. So we've seen quite a few examples, haven't we, of where the price of energy in the UK has effectively driven people out of business. So I don't know if you saw, there was one of the pottery manufacturers, Royal Stafford in Stoke-on-Trent. Effectively, they just cannot make their industry work on current energy prices. So the trade union guy, Colin Griffiths of the GMB, said Stoke can't power its kilns with wind and batteries. So it has a real impact on energy costs for industry. It's the same for chemicals industry, the cement industry. We've talked before about the steel industry. Electrical equipment manufacture is down 50%. Grangemouth facing closure. So it's a massive deindustrialisation powered by, the green industry, I would say.
And even on other businesses which are not so dependent on energy, but shops, cafes,
absolutely.
restaurants.
Yep.
Any business owner out there will know how much of their cost is down to energy.
Yeah. So this is something that I think we really do need to tackle. I perhaps should also just throw in one additional worry in my certainly in my mind, which is you'll be aware that Keir Starmer's been talking quite a bit about wanting to rebuild our relationships with Europe.
What a rude interruption.
That was, yeah.
Keir Starmer's been...
Do you think it's Keir Starmer?
Right.
Out there thinking, oh, we better stop this.
It's a protester. What's he been doing?
He wants to build better relationships with Europe,
Okay.
is what he's said. And one of the things that I think he is considering is whether or not we should sign up to the EU's emissions trading scheme, the ETS.
I don't like the sound of it.
No.
I've become very cynical of these things.
Any three-letter acronym is to be scared of, isn't it? Now, it is a bit of a friction in trade with the EU not being in the ETS, because at the moment when goods reach the European border, they effectively have to pay what you might call a tariff, which is the difference between the carbon trading scheme in the UK and the ETS in Europe.
Okay.
Which is, part of the deal that we have with the EU. Now, if we were on their terms, on their ETS, that friction wouldn't happen.
Okay. And is this carbon thing, is it like a cap and trade thing?
Yeah, it's where if you want to manufacture and produce carbon, you have to effectively buy the license to do that, and you can trade those abilities to produce carbon.
Okay.
Now, I think that's bad enough, the idea that we might sign up to the European ETS, but there's now also talk of an ETS2, a kind of second version of ETS 2.0, which will be even more stringent. And my guess is if we were to go into ETS1, we'd effectively also be signing up for ETS2. So in terms of the price of energy and the effect on industry, I think it feels mad to be contemplating this. Now, you might say, yeah, but it reduces that friction from trade with Europe. But what it would also mean is that anything that isn't exported to Europe costs more in the UK because we're applying this scheme in the UK. And if we're exporting it somewhere else, it'll cost more. So it only reduces that friction and the trade costs for our trade with Europe. But signing up for it for the UK would increase costs for everybody. So that's something I think we need to keep an eye on and make sure that we don't end up there by happenstance, really, or by neglect. So I kind of think that's about all I want to say. Perhaps the only other little thing to mention is that there is, as well on your energy bill as the cost of your energy and the cost of your standing charge, there's this green levy.
Okay.
And that applies to business as well. Now, it's interesting that even the Climate Change Committee, CCC, is saying that they can't see the rationale for that continuing. Because what it does is if you took that off electricity, for example, that would make electricity cheaper and make people more willing to go electric. And electricity is better than gas for the environment. So if you remove that levy, that green levy from electricity supplies, you would make it more attractive. So even the Climate Change Committee, which you can't say is critical of climate change, is arguing that maybe that it's time to review that. So that's quite an interesting thing as well. And I think that's about 10% of your charge.
Yeah.
So, if they were to remove that, if government is keen on making the cost of living crisis better for everybody, perhaps that's one thing that they could do. Okay.
You look like you're getting very emotional about this. Of course, you're just suppressing a cough.
I just... I shouldn't have had those nuts earlier, should I? Yes, I think that's everything I want to say on the price cap.
Okay, well, join us tomorrow for Stephen Ballog, who will be talking about transport.
Yes.
And I think that's all from us. So make sure you like, subscribe.
All those
Remember,
things.
you can email us if you've got anything to say about the show or any questions to ask.
Please do.
And thank you for listening.